Titles of distinction. He is the Prince of Plastics, the maven of manufacturing, the connoisseur of cheese curds. He is also, among other things, someone who's identified himself as the Chancellor of charts, showing the profound depth of our border security crisis. He's been working on this ever since he first became the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee back in 2015. He's built on these charts, and he's built on them in a way that has resulted in them catching fire. You'll now see politicians all over the country at every level of government, and I mean every level of government, utilizing his charts because they're the best in the business. Let's hear from him now.
Well, I thank my colleague from Utah. I was not aware of all those titles, but I'll accept them. If we would have had a trial, and it's a travesty we haven't. I mean, there's been great damage done to our Constitution, to this institution, by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle because they didn't want the American people to see this. Now, I've described this chart. Had we had a trial, this would have been the irrefutable DNA evidence that proved the crime. There's no way you can take a look at the history of illegal entry in this country and not recognize that what has happened under the Biden administration, under Secretary Mayorkas, is nothing less than an utter catastrophe. Yesterday, I spent about 10, 15 minutes on the floor going through the history, the cause and effect that this chart shows. But what I really want to point out today is what the Democrats did not want us to reveal. Because what this chart shows is that this was purposeful. This was willful. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, our Democrat colleagues here in Congress, in the Senate, they want an open border. They caused this crisis. This didn't just happen. This was a game plan that they implemented. They aided and abetted all the damage, all the destruction, all the crimes that result of this. They have aided and abetted it. What this chart does show is the lawlessness started back in 2012 under the Obama administration under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This took prosecutorial discretion, which is, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, but I believe that's supposed to be applied on a case-by-case basis. President Obama took prosecutorial discretion and granted it to hundreds of thousands of people. That is what has sparked every surge in illegal immigration since that point in time. I used to have a chart that just showed unaccompanied children. And prior to the DACA, it was maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 unaccompanied children per year that our federal government had to account for and had to deal with. In 2014, because of DACA, we encountered 69,000 unaccompanied children. 69,000. And even back then, President Obama, when his Department of Homeland Security, his Customs and Border Patrol were dealing with 2,200 illegal immigrants being encountered per day, he declared that a humanitarian crisis. 2,200 people a day. And by the way, I went down to McAllen, Texas, with a bunch of Democrat colleagues in February 2015 during this surge. And people were singing the praises of CBP, of kind of skirting bureaucratic rules and setting up a detention facility. They would protect children. They used chain link fences. Again, we were singing their praises. Democrats were singing the praises of CBP. A few years later, when President Trump had to deal with the crisis, again, sparked by the unlawful DACA memorandum, all of a sudden Democrats were saying it was kids in cages. Do you notice the double standard? I won't go through all the history, but I will point out President Trump, because the reality of the situation was we were letting children in We couldn't detain them. You had the Flores reinterpretation that said that children, even accompanied by their parents, couldn't be detained. People around the world noticed that, so they started coming. They started creating fake families. Children are being sold, in testimony for my committee, children are being sold for $81 to create a family. A little boy was found abandoned in a field of 100 degrees temperatures. He'd already been used. He created that family. The other people got in and they just left him there. The only identification was a phone number written on his shoe. President Obama, Secretary Mayorkas, said they had to undo all of President Trump's successful border security provisions because it said those were inhumane. There's nothing humane about facilitating the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet. The human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the drug traffickers. How many overdose deaths have we experienced throughout America because of this open border policy? There's nothing humane about that. When President Trump faced his peak, it was a sharp rise, but a sharp fall. In May of 2019, almost 4,800 people entered this country illegally. But President Trump did something about it. He used what the Supreme Court said in the 2018 decision, our existing law, that exuded deference to the president. So even though that presidential authority had been weakened somewhat by the Flores reinterpretation of that settlement, even with that weakened authority, President Trump took the bull by the horns, instituted Remain in Mexico, safe third world countries, had to threaten the president of Mexico with tariffs so he would cooperate. But in 12 months, President Trump went from his peak to his trough. A little more than 500 people a day entering this country. Now, what's interesting about this chart, that was, again, April of 2020. Why did the numbers go up? Pretty simple explanation. That was in the midst of a presidential campaign, and every Democrat presidential candidate pledged that they would end deportations, they'd give free health care. And the world took notice. People started coming in anticipation of President Biden taking office. And then once President Biden took office, the catastrophe began. And again, President Biden, now he claims he doesn't have the authority. No, he has all the authority that President Trump had to close the border. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, used that exact same authority, purposefully, willfully, to open up the border. So President Biden didn't need more laws. Secretary Mayorkas didn't need more laws to fix this problem. They caused the problem. They have the authority. We would have been happy to strengthen the authority, to overrule the Flores reinterpretation. They weren't asking for that. All our Democrat colleagues wanted was political cover. That's the truth. So we went from a humanitarian crisis under Obama of 2,200 people a day. Trump had almost 4,800 people a day, but he fixed it. President Biden, his record is more than 10,000 people a day in December of last year. 10,000 people a day. During his entire administration, he's averaged 7,800 people in this country illegally because he has welcomed them. He's incentivized them. He wanted an open border. He caused this problem. And our Democrat colleagues would not even listen to evidence, would not let the House managers make their case of the lawlessness, of the willfulness, of the lying to Congress, because they didn't want the American people to see this. Now, I've shown this chart to Secretary Mayorkas. I'll show it to him again tomorrow when he comes for our committee. First time I showed this, a couple of years ago, it looked almost as bad. But I asked him, Secretary Mayorkas, don't you recognize this is a crisis? And this is what he's saying, we've got a secure border. wouldn't say it's a crisis. Well, would you at least admit it's a problem? No, Senator, it's a challenge. Now, I would view that as a lie. I would have liked to have heard the evidence presented by the House managers of other instances where Secretary Mayorkas lied to Congress, which, again, as I thought was definitely pointed out by Senator from Louisiana. Isn't that a felony? And doesn't impeachment only have to be a misdemeanor? Again, so there's so much wrong in what our Democrat colleagues did today by just summarily, cavalierly dismissing these charges. It's going to come back to haunt our country. But my final point will be this disaster, it's on a chart. It's numbers. They're colors. But the real disaster is with the individuals who've lost their lives, who've lost loved ones. The children who have been raped, who've been caught in the crossfire of the gang wars. That's the real challenge, or that's the real catastrophe. That's the real problem. The Democrats just today swept under the rug. It's a travesty. It shouldn't have happened. But we'll continue to prosecute this case right up until November.
Grateful for those insights that we've had from our friend and colleague, the distinguished senior senator from Wisconsin.